All right, so let's get into it. I'm gonna make this as brief as possible. These days, okay, let's start with the pandemic. The pandemic struck, and I didn't know what the heck I was gonna do. I started gardening. No, I think I actually started gardening before the pandemic because I was like, bruh, I'm broke, I don't have any money, and I can't go out to eat at restaurants all the time. So I need to grow my own food. Shout out to Ron Finley, who is right here in LA. And I visited Ron Finley and I was completely inspired. Now, I was very happy to meet him because when I lived abroad, I had watched many videos about him, and his philosophy really inspired me. And so even before the pandemic, I started gardening to survive, and yeah, so that really didn't change. Yeah, gardening, that was before the pandemic. But what did change during the pandemic is I picked up, reading. All right, and I'm going to talk about this book. These are two different versions of the same book, but that's the one thing that changed during the pandemic. I started reading a lot more. And let's see. For starters, I'm not a huge reader. I wasn't a huge reader, a big reader. Wasn't a big fan of reading because it requires so much focus. And, to be successful, the video I made yesterday, I said I identified 3 qualities for becoming successful that I believe. These are just me, pontificating, conjecturing, just randomly saying. These are the things that I think make someone successful. That's starting very early or starting young, working diligently, and also having focus. All right, having a single goal and working toward that goal. These are the ingredients for success gumbo, if you will. All right, and you know, with regard to focus, I wasn't focused when I was in school because I watched so much, so much television that I really couldn't focus on reading a book. I couldn't sit down and do it. My mind would race. As many people, have this same scenario played out when they attempt to read a book as well. Um, Now, because we have these iPhones today, and we have these different apps, you could use a Kindle, you could use your iPad mini or iPad or whatever to read books. But I found that downloading audiobooks onto my iPhone, listening to the words on the page as I'm reading, as I'm looking at the pages, really helped me to get through large texts. All right, texts. And I just wish I had that technology available during high school. I would have actually read many of the works that Mr. Smolin, peace to Mr. Smolin, my English and even AP English, teacher, um, you know, assigned us. I would have read more of those books. I recall one quick story about being in high school. I recall getting a list of books from Mr. Smolin in his class, and we had to write a book review. Well, I chose the one book that I figured Mr. Smolin hadn't read or that he really wasn't up on in order to write my review, because I certainly wasn't going to read the book and then write the review. I mean, shame on me, of course. Um, and so, yeah, that book was Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison. And I figured, well, Smolin isn't so inclined to just sit back. He doesn't strike me as a Toni Morrison, reader. So I said, I'm gonna choose that book. I'm gonna write my review, submit it, and he gave me a decent grade on it. So I was like, woo, dodge that bullet. That's a little story about mine. But then there are other works, smaller works that we read. The Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. I read that. We read that as a class, and then I also read that on my own. And That was all because it was a short book. So I could get through short text. But these long ones, all right. For instance, this book right here, I'm showing you two copies here because this is the actual copy that I had seen in my mom and dad's library for a number of years. And I would, thumb through it, and I would say to myself, one day I'll read this book, one day I'll do it. And sometimes, even when I was in high school, I sat down and I read a few pages and then I walked away and I never completed the task. And it's an older version. I believe it was printed in the, let's see, copyright. 1962. Yep, 1962. That's what I was going to guess, in the 60s. So this book was copywritten. It was printed in 1960. It was printed in 1962. Copywritten, or what, in the 1800s when it was actually written. Revised edition, reprinting from the revised edition of 1892. So, all right, whatever. So this was the book. All right. I always looked at Frederick Douglass, and I always, looked at him with, admiration. I have a photo of him up here, postcard, and I said, man, I respect that man. I should learn more about him. And he actually does have the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, or the narrative of the life of a slave, which is a much smaller book. Still, I don't think I read that book. But this book was in our library. I always looked at it and I said, one day I'm going to read it. So 2020 happens and I've got all of this time on my hands, and I'm definitely pro-black. So I'm like, man, I better get down and read this book. I've got to get to it. So I start checking it out, start reading it, and I download the audiobook, and that helps me get through it. And I discover that this is a book that I should have read, or that even if I couldn't have read it on my own, this should have been a book that we were learning or studying as Americans, in school, and not some of that Shakespeare and all of that, Joycean, James Joyce, T.S. Eliot, and all of that stuff, man. We should have been learning about good old Frederick Douglass right here, man. This man lived our lives, lived the lives that, that we live today, because he was able to go from, being an enslaved person all the way to being, a dignified dignitary, a diplomat in government at the highest levels. So at every point, at every stage in his life, there is something, a lived experience that we can connect to, that we can share, with him. And there's so many things that this man says in this book that are so profound, because you're like, damn, that's exactly the experience I'm having. And that's the perspective that I have. So he understood and understands what it is that, we live through, to this day. But I didn't even know that. Didn't even, spend the time to learn about this. Let me give you a specific example of what I'm talking about. Jay-Z, in his rhyme, said something to the effect, I can't quote him offhand. He said something like, you guys want me on the cover of your magazines in order to sell, more magazines, right? And taken in today's context, you're like, well, that's capitalism, and that's just, business, and that's how, these business people work. Well, that's true for Jay-Z, because he is this very popular, influential man. But that statement that Jay-Z made is a statement that Frederick Douglass made about his life, because during his time, he was the most popular. He was the most photographed black man of his era, of his time. So he was wildly popular and wildly influential. He had a tremendous amount of power. And people wanted his image. People wanted to put him, to use his name and to use his image to sell their works. And he even complained about that in this book. I don't know. I didn't take good notes. That's one of the That's one of the problems with me being a sort of a beginner or intermediate reader as a hobby. I need to take better notes, okay? Because then I could just go to it and say, ah, this is exactly where he said that. But that's one point that I recall from this book. Um, Now, as an audiobook reader, as I use the audiobook to follow along, or I followed along with the book as I listened to the audiobook, as the reader on the audiobook, I discovered that although these are two books with the same titles, they have slightly different, or actually very different versions, okay? The sentence structure is in this book is completely different from the sentence structure in this book. Let me give you an example. If I were to say, while I was eating, I looked out the window and I saw a bird. If that's the sentence, while I was eating, I looked out the window and saw a bird, that is how the sentence would be presented in one text, for instance, in this text. And then in this text, the sentence would be presented as, I saw a bird out the window while I was eating, or while he was eating, in this case, Frederick Douglass. So as you're reading, you have to do a double take at that sentence because the words do not match the text. So that's something that I discovered as an audio book follow along reader. You know, the text don't match the audio. All right, but it wasn't challenging. It wasn't too challenging. It wasn't very difficult. I was able to follow along and get through the book, and I had a tremendous. I had a joy. It was a joy reading this book and getting to know Mr. Frederick Douglass, as well as his many adventures, or rather trials and tribulations, because it's the life of an enslaved person is they're not really adventures, but they're really struggles. All right. Let's see. I'll try to. There's one story about Frederick Douglass's escape. It's been about a month or two since I read it. If I can retell it without any mistakes, that would be a miracle. But so Frederick Douglass decides that he and four other enslaved, Africans, enslaved blacks, are going to escape. They devise a plan, and they're going to take a boat, and they're going to go up the river, and they are going to forge documents, forge papers that say that their master has sent them up the river for supplies. And Frederick holds on to these documents. So he tells four other enslaved, men, men who he trusts, and men who are friends, and men who he wants to see free. He tells his guys, we're going to escape. I've got the plan. We have the paper. We're going to do this. We're going to leave in the morning, and we're going to be free. Now, what happens is one of the men he tells this backs out of the program and squeals. He snitches, and he tells the master or whatever what the plan is. And that morning that they're preparing to escape, the master comes riding on his horse and pulls up, and he's like, Frederick, you and these other three guys, these slaves, come here. You're going down. We know the plan. The guy told us the whole plan. We know what you're up to. This could have meant that they were going to all be dead, that they were all going to be killed, or severely punished, or separated from their families and sold off to other plantations. So the master stands before, at this point, all four men, Frederick and these three other enslaved men. And that other enslaved man was the tattletale, the snitch. He's off or whatever. And so the master goes to each man and he tells them, you better tell me the truth. Were you trying to escape? You better tell me. Don't lie to me. I know what you were doing. And each man says, no, sir, I wasn't trying to do that. I wasn't trying to escape. Goes to the second man, the same scenario. He says, were you trying to escape? He said, no, sir, I wouldn't do that. No, sir. Goes to the third man. No, sir, no, sir, no, sir, no, sir. So at this point, the master is, his doubt is growing. He said, man, that guy told me, that enslaved man, that slave told me that you guys were up to something, but you're telling me you're not up to it. You're telling me you're not up to it. You're telling me you're not up to it. Now I've got to ask Frederick, and if you guys all say that you weren't up to this, that you weren't up to escaping, and it's just your word against his, then he's like, man, I'm gonna really need to do something here. Either that guy was lying, or I'm gonna have to punish all of you guys. It's like, what was he gonna do in that situation? Now, in that moment, Frederick is realizing, yo, I have this paper in my pocket. And if the master happens to see this paper, he's going to know that, yes, we did have a plan. He will have evidence that we did have a plan with a forged signature from him saying that they were going to go up the river. So basically, while the master's attention is on one of the other men, Frederick takes that paper and shoves it and throws it away or what have you. So finally, when it comes time for Frederick to address the issue, he can say with a clear conscience, or, he's lying, but he doesn't have any evidence on him. And he's like, no, that guy's a liar. We're not up to anything. Well, with the master having his suspicions, he still found a way to punish all four of the men, okay? Sent them to a jail, and then he eventually arrives at the conclusion that Frederick is too smart of a man at this point, that he cannot be controlled by this peculiar institution of slavery, that he's just got to really get rid of him, because he couldn't be controlled. Now the other men, well, it was known that these other slaves were illiterate. Frederick was the one who was literate, and this was known. And so Frederick's punishment was the most severe of those four men, or actually of all five, including Frederick. So Frederick was imprisoned, and his imprisonment lasted longer, and it was more severe. And it was because of his intelligence. It was because of his power and influence. Even at that time, before he was a statesman, a stately figure, he was this educated, enslaved person. And Frederick felt what I found very interesting about this book is Frederick expressed his sorrow and sadness and his guilt. He said he felt guilty that he involved these other men in his plot to escape. Now, he had every good intention to help these men gain their freedom through escaping, but when the plan fell through, when everything fell apart, Frederick felt deep regret for endangering these men's lives, because they could have been killed. He could have been killed. And that really showed character. That really showed, that, Frederick was a deep thinker. He had created this whole plan of escape, and at the same time, he was also thinking of his fellow man. He was thinking in their interest. And when the plan fell apart, he was also thinking of, how sorry he was that things fell apart like that. And then there's some other stories about how later he did find these men, reconcile with them, and that's all I'll say, because I don't remember what transpired thereafter. But man, this was an excellent read. I mean, this was an excellent life that we should have been told. We should have learned about this man in in schools. This is an American story, an American life. One of the greatest American figures in history, and we did not have a class about him? I mean, what does that say about the American educational system? My goodness, Frederick Douglass should be taught in every school. There should be a Frederick Douglass University. My goodness. Excellent book, highly recommended. And if you're not a good reader, I suggest you get an audio book. Download the audio book, listen to the story. It'll help you get through it. It helped me get through it. This is a testimonial, and I'll say, I love reading. Now I love reading, and if you want to get there too, just spend the time. Just spend the time. All you have to do is find a quiet spot next to some plants. Put the headphones on and do your thing. Enjoy yourself. Have a blessed day. The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. Peace.